We're kicking off the season with two good friends of many of you and of the Tuesday evening programs, Richard Wentworth and Gavin Morrison. Richard was here in September of 2008. Some of you may recall. You may have been trying to do the math and figure out just when that was. It was in 2008. He was here with a presentation titled Walking Through the Hedges Backwards, which is very Richard. And Gavin was here in March 2009 with his presentation on a hypothetical proposal for a Texas pavilion at the 2011 Venice Biennale, and that is very Gavin. So we're so happy to have them back here tonight. Richard Wentworth, CBE, which is acknowledging his appointment to the Order of Chivalry of the British Constitutional Monarchy for his contributions in art, has played a leading role in the New British sculpture since the end of the 1970s. Recently described in the Telegraph as having worked with Henry Moore, having designed sets for Roxy Music, and having helped launch the YBAs. Richard has a career full of stories, and you might say that he sees stories everywhere he looks. Known for his keen eye and constant engagement in his environment, as realized in his work, both sculpture and photography, Richard is shown throughout the world. He was included in the 52nd Venice Biennale in 2009, and most recently he had a solo exhibition, Bold Tendencies, in London this past year. In addition, Richard has curated some very interesting exhibitions and has a number of books to his credit as both the author and the subject. In fact, the monograph, Making Do and Getting By, on Richard's photographic series by the same name, published by Koenig Books in association with Peter Freeman Gallery and the Lisson Gallery, and the impetus of tonight's presentation, is scheduled for release today. However, by some form of magic, the Modern Store has or had a few copies available before tonight's lecture, so I hope some of you got by and saw those. If any of you missed out tonight and are interested, if there aren't any left, there are some more coming. You can put your name on the list and reserve one, and we will keep ordering them as long as there are people asking for them. Gavin Morrison, a writer and curator, received a Master's of Art in Mental Philosophy from the University of Edinburgh, followed by a postgraduate residency with the core program at the Museum of Fine Art Houston's Glassell School, which I believe is what initially brought him to Texas, correct. He eventually landed in Fort Worth as the first curator of TCU's Fort Worth Contemporary Art from 2007 to 2009. He is currently the artistic director of the Skaftfell, the Center for Visual Art in East Iceland, as well as the director of the curatorial and publishing initiative Utopia Projects, which I encourage you to get online and look up. It's very interesting. As curator of the Fort Worth Contemporary Art, Gavin curated an exhibition titled Uncommon Sense in 2008, which included the work of Tom Sachs and Rebecca Barron, as well as Richard Wentworth, showing work from Richard's photographic series, Making Do and Getting By. So if you walked into tonight's program blind, you're likely making the connections of why Gavin and Richard are here. Gavin Morrison and Richard Wentworth share an intellectual curiosity, a thoughtfulness and sensitivity that draws them to each other's work and has assured their friendship for over many years. Tonight, we are the beneficiaries of that relationship as they are in conversation about the contents of the recent publication, Making Do and Getting By, about making images, making books, and I suspect much more. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Richard Wentworth and Gavin Morrison.
Thank you. hope everyone can hear me. And it's obviously great to be back here and great to be here doing it with Richard. I was glad that Terry mentioned the show on Common Sense, which we did in 2008. And it reminded me that when you arrived here in 2008, it was the day in which Lehman Brothers collapsed and Damien Hirst had his mega yard sale at Sotheby's, which seems a sort of suitable collision of history, which I guess fits in with a lot of your work. So maybe we could start by asking you what your history of when you started making work, how you ended up at art school.
Whoa. Well, I think I've met some of you during the day, so I might be repeating things, but I've become I'm nearly 70, so I've got enough lived time to think quite broadly about, well, what is that? How does that happen? I mean, you fail to die, and you're here, and you have a narrative. I mean, everyone has a narrative, but I think there's a sort of point at which you have more narrative to think about, and not even in a very egotistical way. You're just curious about how does this stuff assemble itself into this thing that's called a life. And I think, I don't know how it works here at the moment, but I think there's a pressure on young people at the moment to professionalize themselves. There's a kind of almost proposal that if you do A, B, and C, then D, E, and F will follow, and it might even be called something very strange called a career. Where I would suggest that actually what happens is that the career is the thing that you have, that you see behind you, and you'll never make much sense of it if you're trying to look at it in front. And I say that because I was an unhappy schoolboy in a funny time, which is the early 60s in Britain, which is now rendered fabulous, but some of you may know a writer called Angela Carter, who's no longer with us, but she said the 60s wasn't like the movies. And I was, I'm old enough to have been there. And I kind of fumbled my way out of school by really thanks to one very good art teacher, who I think I sort of recognize now was almost a fraternal relationship. I mean, he was very generous and permissioning to me. I don't think I was any kind of favorite. I doubt he would even recognize what he offered me. So there was him, and then that nice thing where you have a series of accidents. So I met somebody that some of you have heard of by accident in the summer, and I've always thought it was in the summer of '65, a man called John Berger, who of course I was a kind of gauche 19-year-old, so I had no idea who John Berger was. But then I was corrected recently by a young man who said, no, you didn't meet John Berger in 1965, you met him in 1966. And I felt slightly like, by what right do you have to tell me what year I met? I might have early onset datism, but I'm in charge. And then he said, no, it was 66, because it was the summer of Pet Sounds. And I foolishly had said it was the summer of Pet Sounds, which I am a person at that time. And so I did indeed meet John Berger in the summer of 1966. And all I'm really trying to suggest is that you're not probably choosing very much at school. You think you are. But then things start to happen and they fit together. So I was a student with somebody you've all heard of called Zoe Wanamaker, who was a foundation student with me at a college called Hornsey, which doesn't exist anymore. And then I was a student with somebody else you'll have heard of called James Dyson at the Royal College. But I didn't like him very much, so I went to another department, which was called the sculpture department. But I think what I'm trying to suggest is that things get woven together, and much as one would like to claim responsibility for that, stuff happens.
And, okay, keeping on this personal history, that you also worked, as Terry mentioned in the introduction, with certain artists in the past, such as Henry Moore. How did that inform you, and how did that relationship express itself?
Okay, I'm very conscious that I talk too much and my answers might be too long. So.
Impossible.
Well, my parents lived near something which now exists but didn't exist then, but you guys built. So they lived near something which we call Stansted Airport, but is actually a US bomber base from the Second War. And the length of its runways are because that's how big the bombers were. And I have to say, whenever I use that airport, which is a lot, and I often go to Germany from it, I think, well, that is how weird history is. And it costs me almost nothing to do it. And it certainly doesn't cost me my life. So my parents lived near there, but so did Henry Moore. So this airport wasn't actually functioning at the time, but the concrete was there. And like any other, opportunistic person, I thought, well, I will write that little letter, Dear Mr. Moore, it would be convenient for me to mix your plaster next summer. Would that be interesting for you? I don't know what I said. It's when we wrote letters, I think that's quite important. And I think writing a letter, somebody was tormenting me the other day in email, a really unpleasant email. And of course, it would have to be a member of my family. And I wrote and I described what it meant to write a letter. You had to get the ink bottle and you had to kind of pump up the pen and you had to set the paper out and you had to decide what it was you were going to say, and you might even make a fair copy. And I think I'm sad I don't need to get inky letters anymore, but I think that is quite an interesting process of how we speak to each other. So I wrote Henry Moore a letter, and I suppose it must have revealed something about me. And so I think he invited me to go to where he lived. And he was about how old I am now. And actually what I remember was not thinking that he was, inverted commas, old. And he said, you can come here in the summer and there'll be some work for you to do. And of course those, we're now I'm sure that some of you, a lot of you are artists, and some of you maybe are artists who employ other artists, and some of you are the other way around. There's the ones who employ, and then the one, you know what I mean. But that didn't really exist then. I mean, I think this idea that art was some activity of commercial production wasn't very powerful. I don't know whether Rothko had people stretching his canvases down the other end of the studio. So I think we use time very differently, and we have different expectations. But in the summer of 1967, to the sounds of Sgt. Pepper, I mixed a lot of plaster for Henry Moore. And in fact, one of the Henry Moores I made is in the Kimball. Not in the Kimball, in the Nasher. And it's always rather strange to see it, because I think I got that bit wrong.
Which bit did you get wrong?
That bit. But of course, what I'm trying to say is that those things are, you're young, he's old, he's quite, he's established. He was a perfectly pleasant person to be around. And I think I learned something about studio procedure. I mean, a lot of making sculpture is actually, it's quite dumb. I mean, it's related to lots of trades that everybody knows. It's related to baking or lots of kitchen activities, lots of plastering, lots of construction activity. And you often get people who'll move across those. And I think we're bad at talking about trades. I mean, trades are more interesting than crafts. I think Martin Purrier told me that. Mm-hmm. Always say trades, don't say craft.
But you're, I suppose could be seen as two sides to your practice, roughly, as much as you're a maker of things in a way that is consistent with a studio practice, and then there's also which I guess is more the concern here, but of the photographic, a looking practice or a pointing practice or something. But they do seem to be intricately interwoven. How do you see those two parts working together?
Well, I'm very uncomfortable with it, actually. I think, I know there are people here who are authorities on art or on sculpture, or how this developed, or who said what to who on what day of, that Picasso would never have made any sculpture if Gonzalez didn't come to tea. All these little associations. And I think that the whole the mediation of our time, I'm going to guess that there's 20 people here who are my age, and then there are going to be 40 people here who could be my children. I'm not suggesting that. That was ageist. But actually, I think if you sort of even note down what we take for granted about how we understand the world and how that proceeded over 50 years. It was moderately common 50 years ago that you could find somewhere in Britain which didn't have electricity. Not very common, but it wouldn't have been incredibly surprising. I think that's unthinkable. So that sense that the world is mediated, and that how we perceive the world and how we exchange it with each other has just changed enormously. So there won't be anyone in here who hasn't received some kind of photographic image today in their pocket, I think. We could have a show of hands for I haven't, but you're not going to be very many. So there's a kind of speed of visual comprehension that we didn't used to have. And I'm not suggesting I anticipated that, but I think I think seeing and wanting to tell somebody else what you have seen is quite a primary human desire. And we didn't used to be able to do that. So there was a small group of people who might do that because they drew. And there was another group of people who would do that by telling, sort of essayists, if you like. And certainly the press would often play to that. There might be a column where there was a discussion about what was a thing seen. But I think I became interested in the idea that we see and we can share. And it wasn't a very self-conscious thing, and it certainly was never a project. But I think it's a very, very powerful, I would say it's a sort of almost folkloric space. And you could perhaps test it. You could say, do we not each day tell somebody else something that we have seen? And sometimes we send them what we have seen. And I think that what's very important for me is that isn't really to do with photography. The means is photographic or reprographic, but it's not the self-conscious act of photography. So I find myself caught in this slightly odd space, which is a bit like chatter.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the. I remember when that show at Fourth Contemporary Arts, somebody came into the gallery who was not a gallery goer, who was coming to fix something or other, and was looking at your photographs there, and started off with a great uncertainty and almost kind of sense of aggression towards them, that they were somehow being deceitful or something, that they were something of the art world which he was not able to access. But then as he moved along it, I think there was a recognition of a sense or a kind of an ordering that was not imposed upon them but arose from the images themselves. And I think that kind of speaks to this idea of it not being a project but rather a generosity or something.
Well, I think it might just be that whoever came in recognised that I'm a bit sick, and then
it's a little bit compensating.
Gave back. I mean, there's a way in which humans recognise things about each other and issue permits for their behaviour. You know, we're all a bit, everyone's slightly autistic. Some of us more than others, and we make allowances for each other, and some of those allowances are actually very productive. If you some of the people that most annoy us, if you kind of just let them be annoying, you can find that, they might actually be the person you live with. That might become a space. That might be, that maybe that's what maybe that's the comedy of being alive. Yeah. And in a way, you've told me, you have mentioned that once before, and I like that. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of seduce anybody, but I think that...
But I think it's that sense of a kind of shared humanity or something, that within that, it's seeing the gesture of looking at things, understanding. Maybe that's the thing is, I've read quite a few descriptions of what the Making, Do and Getting By series is and is about. It's a language, it's a urban exploration, and it seems like all these different definitions, while true, evidently kind of lack something or other. And so it's only through this kind of engagement with looking that you get a true sense of the totality of the project.
Well, maybe another thing is that humans are really pretty good at, or certainly our kind of human is pretty good at looking at the visual and criticizing it. So this is, by definition, a critical audience. But we all know that the news is edited. The news is not some kind of divine truth. It's a piece of highly constructed stuff. So the news could be something you're told. It could be it used to be the front page of the newspaper. Now it's probably online. It might be on television, it might come straight into your phone, but you already know that if it contains imagery, that imagery is articulated. And, half of the great contentions of our time are about from what point of view was that image made. And I think the thing that I'm not well enough educated, there'll be somebody here who is, but the Greek word, or the word pathetic, is from the Greek word pathos. And I think a lot of my pictures are a bit pathetic in both senses. And I think people actually sort of know that I'm not somebody who's going out looking for stuff. I never photograph something. Things have to be an encounter. So in that sense, they're very like how we meet each other. The act of meeting another human is a pretty weird thing. We do it all the time, but you can see that if you've got animals at home, you can see they don't meet in quite the same way. We're very stupid and very sophisticated at the same time. So that moment of friction, where we might, that's the basis of why we don't like some people very much, and that can be mutual, or why we adore somebody, and that might not be mutual. Those are all. There's a kind of metaphor in these, I think.
And I guess that sense. Well, I guess the sense of things coming in contact with other happens both within the images also, and then also in how they're displayed. As often the photographs are paired, framed as pairs, but then with a book, the reading of images becomes different again.
I don't know if any of you are bookmakers, or which in England means that you're involved with betting on horses, but I mean, maybe that's an important thing to let into the conversation. I mean, there are artists who are trained in bookmaking for some historical accident. An artist like Richard Hamilton was, to all intents and purposes, trained as a graphic designer. Germans are very highly trained in graphical organization, and you can see it that's why German photography is like it is. It's a really powerful, long history. I'm not trained in that. I kind of know what books are, and I know that they're sort of magical because they're sequential, but nobody opens a book on the first page. I mean, it's a kind of difficult thing. It's physically quite difficult to do. It's actually a decision to open a book on the first page. You open a book somewhere where it opens, and then you furl. So when it became inevitable that this book was going to happen, and I could feel the forces gathering around me, and I could no longer put it off or fake it or whatever I was doing, it actually fell to other people to make it happen, and it was quite a strange thing to abdicate and trust. So I had a very do you say nerdy in American? Yeah. I had a very nerdy assistant who can't be here tonight. who, if you come to London, I'll introduce you. Is a lovely man called Tom. And Tom was a very screen-based young man, less than half my age, who grew up with the screen. And I gave him really quite big editorial powers, because I sort of recognized that I was not going to be able to control this. And then he in turn worked with a very, not surprisingly, German bookmaker who lives in London called Peter Freeman. But what was very strange was watching them assemble these layouts and then they would send them. Of course, they would send them to me digitally, so I don't think I saw anything that was sort of papery for a long time. But when, through that period of, actually, I think I behaved really well. I almost never said no. That doesn't mean I really agree with what's in the book. It's just being realistic. It's like that you're not going to be able to control this. So things that I wouldn't be very good at, pace, sequence, colour, because I don't come from colour. I come much more from stuff which has colour, but it's not the other way around. I can actually, this is a better way of looking. As they formulated themselves, I started to see how sophisticated it is to actually make a good book which contains photographic imagery. So absolutely avoiding the plonk-plonk pairing. But then there was a very nice moment when the book was actually done, and I showed it to various people, more or less as I encountered them. And I watched, so I was able to, usually at dinner or with a drink, I was able to watch people look at it, and it was really affecting to see people enter the space of looking. So I became, I suddenly thought, oh, well, I'll be Francois Truffaut. I can witness these people. And even people in conversation with other people, where people would point and then go back and double back. And there was one wonderful sequence with a young French woman and her little boy. And just something about the way that a child looks, which is different from how an adult looks, but that the funny sort of conversation, what mutual looking is, which anybody who drives a car with somebody else who talks to somebody else while they're driving a car, you're in a way, you're in the 20th century cinema. The world comes past. Am I being very boring?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Heard it all before.
That's a very good moment to stop saying that. I'm driving. No, you're driving. It's dangerous.
But yeah, I'm honestly interested in how the way in which the work is read differently in the book as opposed to the gallery setting, and the way in which you think of the book. I think it's quite noticeable that I think there is an image of it that comes round of where you open it and there's the first, or one of the early pages, there's a glossary. So immediately it's words and then it's pictures. So and each of the photographs is also minimally titled, I suppose, as a date and a location, sometimes quite specific to a particular part of London, sometimes somewhat more general, saying southwestern France. So yeah, I wonder how you think of the book. Is it like an atlas, a dictionary?
Well, I think it's very like, or I hope it's very like how difficult it is for all of us to tell each other anything. The sort of weakness. When you hear yourself telling another person something, you think, well, that's not quite true, or that was the wrong word, or I said it was Tuesday, but actually it was Monday, or it's very approximate how we relate to each other and how we do, we're making judgments about notions of accuracy or the value of content. But it's a very funny space. And I think I'm sitting here, I'm using these stupid things called words, they're so slow and lumbering, and, thought is so gorgeous, the privacy of these little moments of thought. I think one of these pictures up here might be of my grandmother. Is she up there?
She has come round.
Yeah. So, maybe I should just tell you that, because that's just something terribly available to anybody, but it happened to me. So my grandmother, I've spoiled the story really, but my grandmother died in 1978, maybe I haven't seen her since 1976. I was familiar with her, but not close. So I don't know how many times in my life I saw my grandmother, but, maybe once or twice a year for my first 30, 40 years. So 4 or 5 months ago, I was watching television with my wife, and we were arguing about television, and we were dissing the presenter, who's a young woman historian who perhaps would give a very good talk here, called Lucy Worsley. Lucy Worsley is very busy performing, and she understands television and she likes it, and she's probably about 35 years old, and she's not stupid, and she's telling you that she's excited about things. So that, I don't make television, it's a very difficult thing to do. And my wife was saying, she really annoys me. I wish she'd just button it. And I was saying, hang on. And then I was sort of agreeing. And then I said, why don't we just watch and see what the subject is? So she was interviewing this guy who used to run the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in the 70s, very celebrated man called Roy Strong. And there was a little sequence where she was effectively talking about his career. And there was a little sequence where she said, well, you commissioned Antigone to make a second portrait of the Queen, and that caused a scandal, and people were... And Roy Strong is very theatrical in his disposition, and always has been. And he went, yes, my dear, what a rumpus that was. We were in, gosh, did we get into trouble? And she said, do you regret it? Certainly not. It's a great portrait. And then they cut to some 1969 vox pop. So some people who were presumably, he was running the National Portrait Gallery at the time, who were in there, and they were interviewed. And this archive material has survived. So first of all, there was a student who was talking like a young person and said, I think it's quite interesting, and I'm glad it's done. All edited, of course. And then there was an older woman, and she said something like, I see no reason why the Queen shouldn't look serious. And I went, Granny! And my wife said, oh, are we having a stroke? And it was my grandmother. And so that's 1969, you can do the maths, 1969 to now, gap. She was not a public figure. It's apparently the only time, as far as we can make out, that she was ever filmed. I mean, what are the chances of that? And I'm the only, that she's got 20, well, she would have about 10 grandchildren who could remember her. And I'm the only one that was watching. So you can see, I mean, and actually, I don't think that's art, but it's incredibly confirming, and by what possible method could I have recognized her? I couldn't smell her. Television is a horrible resolution. It's a small set over there. Wasn't watching that closely. I mean, I don't know whether there's a brain scientist in the house, but I mean, that's what interests me, is how do we recognize people? What a thing.
Yeah. And I guess that also kind of alludes to this point you mentioned earlier of, well, we should say that this book is a kind of second volume first, that it represents your works from 2006 to the present, around about there. So it was the images in the book are from when you started working in digital as opposed to film. I guess there's one thing about doing a book in that way, in which the second part comes first, but also a different sense that we have towards images now, like you say, where we can receive things in a much more convenient and rapid manner, and something like Instagram or something where maybe it would be, you could read that as having certain parallels to what you have been doing.
Well, I might go on an Instagram rant. I mean, does one have Instagram, or is it like a baby? I mean, I am on Instagram, but I find all of that stuff unbelievably vulgar. I feel, I mean, I have, I've another pathetic human who's not very sure of themselves and whose confidence is a fake and da-da-da-da-da. I mean, I don't want everybody seeing what I did yesterday like that. I feel, now that might, maybe that's something we should discuss in a minute, because I see half the audience are doing quite vigorous nodding, but I also notice they don't tend to be quite the youngest group. And that might be a really interesting moment that to do with the history of, because actually, as a group here, we're only really able to discuss vigorously, let's say, 50 years. We could give a good account of about 50 years. It's what our adult experience encompasses. But we don't know anything about, the hand axe in the Neanderthal. Well, the hand axe didn't change for 20,000 years. They barely altered it. I mean, 20,000 years is a very, very long time. It's a lot of hitting. You might go, I thought of a new way of doing this. So how those people were people to each other, how they comprehended each other, is not going to become our experience. We can speculate about it. So I have a feeling that a lot of this is attached to why I've become so interested in the idea of what is, even modest historical space. My grandmother was born in 1898, so she's born before flight, etc., etc. But by the time you're ready to interview your grandmother about what her life was like, it's too late anyway. Either she will have forgotten, or you're just going to run out of time. So actually, human experience is very, very limited. And the active part of our lives is very, very short. So there's a sort of sense of loss all the time. So I feel this question about whether it's digital or analog or how it's presented. I mean, we're clearly still able to look at printed pictures, and people clearly. I mean, the book didn't die. The book looks rather well, actually, and I'm sure a lot of us here have had long rants about this will kill the book. It'll be a disaster, and then we see it. That we like to hold things. We like, and the book, of course, is a very remarkable piece of architecture. To have this thing in your lap, which has got a body, adopts your body temperature and furls and so forth, is very different from that. And I'm not going to take against this. I was thinking yesterday about that lovely thing about that landscape painting really took off when paint got into a tube. And I was thinking, oh, how bizarre, what would it be like to be in a world without a tube of paint? Well, I've never known that world.
Yeah. Because, I guess this idea of the book as a document, it makes this kind of historical reading of the work much more tangible as well, that the histories within the images become more evident in the sense that you can feel the passage of time in a sense more clearly, and then also the name of the series, Making, Doing, Getting By, has this very strong historical suggestion towards a wartime era mentality and attitude. Maybe you could say your attitude towards history, of the way in which history is embedded within images and looking and just the material facts of the world?
Well, I don't know whether I can say anything very interesting about it, but I think
just even today when we were over at the piano extension pavilion and thinking of the going to the auditorium at the back, and there's this leaning wall, and you were talking of it feeling medieval and being evocative of certain historical elements. And then there's also within the actual objects that these things have histories or suggest histories or have these arise from particular histories.
I mean, maybe a way of doing this is to sort of go back to this Henry Moore thing a little bit, which is really interesting. Henry Moores are probably from the 30s. So they're not very big. They feel very direct. They actually often feel like you could feel his body warmth in them. You can feel that they're like how it feels to peel an apple or deal with the vegetable. You know, something quite immediate which you attend to. And you know, if you're interested in that period across particularly European art making, people are a little bit righteous about how things are made. There's a truth to materials school. It feels like a rather moral time, and one can more or less work out why that might be historically after the First War. But there's a sense that things are done directly. So by the time I'm making Henry Moores, they're actually theatre sets. He would give me a little thing like this, which he would have made in his lap, usually out of plaster. And you'd put dots all over it and put it on squared paper and work out where the dots were in space. It's quite old, I would guess. The Egyptians would know about it, but certainly known about in the Renaissance. And then you'd make a big one. So if that was an inch up, and he said, as he sometimes did, times 8, Richard, you'd get an 8-foot long pole and put that pole in space, and you would establish all these points in space, and then you would join them up, and then you would, if you like, make what you would now do with a computer. And I often think how funny it would be if Henry had had that opportunity. But you're actually inventing something which is a kind of quote of a quote of a quote. It's a bit like in those court scenes when they call old American court dramas where the person is called down the corridors and these names bounce around. You sort of feel it's getting lost in the process. I'm not quite so sure I'm saying this, but it's something to do with loss of information. Mm-hmm. I'm often a bit circular when I speak, and I apologise.
But I guess one of the things I'm quite aware of is your work is not like the geography teacher. You're not trying to impart any particular history, but rather...
That's because I'm in geography.
Right, well, that would be the case.
Oh, I know why I said that.
Yeah.
I think that I said that because I think because we're all in historical space and we're all struggling with difference all the time. So I don't know how many ethnicities there are in the room, or how many people have sent away to find out who they are. You know, how strange to have lived to a period where you can spit into a bag and send it to an American university, and tomorrow you can find out that you're a bit African, slightly Asian, and on Tuesdays you're Alaskan. I mean, which is, of course is politically, I think is kind of delicious, and I wonder if we might be headed for a moment where we're all obliged to do that, because it's going to make some things very clear to all of us. I haven't done it. So how we occupy our own sense of our own little p politic is really incredibly contingent, and it's, most days I hear something that locates me in history in a completely new way, and I'm usually embarrassed. I'm usually, when I understand how that happened, or how that border got made that made these people, and those people, I'm very humbled. It's usually a private humility, mercifully. But, you can be reading the paper and you go, oh my God, somebody in the British Empire ran out of ink and finished that with a wiggly line, or, this is elaborate. And I think that the book has that funny feeling of sequence, and there's no self-consciousness. I don't really know where the title Making Do and Getting By came from, but I used it probably in about 1970. Making do was a wartime term, but I wasn't in the war. But, everybody is living with the backwash of somebody else's experience.
Are we okay for time?
We have about 5 minutes.
So let's shut up.
Well, should we have some questions? Would that be a smart idea? Oh, well. Yeah, is there anybody? No?
Is there anyone coming to London?
I am coming to London, and I have a question. I'll get it started, and maybe some other people will speak up. But there are so many things that I recognize in this work that I wonder about. So I've been sitting here thinking and talking and trying to think, well, what do I want to know most? And I guess in the public setting, if it's not too large a question, could you talk about the relationship of profundity and absurdity? And because I sense that in the work, that you see it, that you see that there's something humorous and maybe even absurd about some of the solutions that people, or the decisions that people make in these problem-solving occasions that you capture or that you acknowledge. But then there's something about them too that you recognize, just that notion of the pathetic and pathos, the notion that they're telling you something important. Can you talk a little bit about your feelings on that? Do you see that in those occasions?
Well, I can do it another way, which is that we had a conversation last night about decision making, and I said, after a drink but not drunk, I said, well, we don't really make decisions. We just deal with the consequences of a situation which leads to something which passes for a decision. So mostly, even where you sit, where you're all sitting, that's all. These situations are always wonderful. The arbitrariness of sitting somewhere and then you find you're sitting next to your worst enemy, or that's a deeply political space, and all of us think we're decisive within that. But then, of course, if we're all decisive, then how alarming to be next to the next person's decision. So in fact, you have to relax into some sense of the contingent. Otherwise, you would go mad. And most of us, in fact, are extreme. The moment I even start talking about that, I feel quite anxious, because I think it denies responsibility. You start to feel, I'm not in control. But you're not in control anyway. That's the deal. So everybody is has to resolve some way to be in the world which has some pliancy in it, and where, for multiple reasons, we're anxious. And I think a lot of, to give a sort of really tidy or untidy, slightly confessional thing, is that I grew up in a quite judgmental household, in a kind of, in English you would say, tutty. And I think that was quite common in the 50s anyway, across all the classes. There was something about, there was a kind of, there was some kind of collective anxiety about, let's try and get the world to face in the right direction or something. And I often have conversations with people where they say, oh, I recognize that. So there's something to do with being parsimonious, wishing the world were tidier, trying to get the world to behave better, to conform. And I think that my only way out of that was to take a form of, we'll call it the judgmental, and project it onto the world. So I always see a crack in the glass before I ever see the window. I will just see the fault. And that might be a kind of illness, maybe there's a psychiatrist here who wants to have a word with me afterwards, but I think it's...
Do you have affection for the fault in the glass?
Yes! I am the fault in the glass. We are, because I think that is what, and the funny thing about the fault in the glass is that it still performs perfectly. It's only the hugely anxious person who decides the glass must be replaced. And in fact, there are many routes along the way to the glass must be replaced, which doesn't replace the glass. So you can put a bit of tape over it, or you can go careful, or window cleaner, sharp, and we do that. Or you can do that. This is sort of a bit of light Fischlian vice. It's like you never see that in Dutch genre painting. It's just not there. It's fine. But so the world, the world is profoundly architectural in a way, and we read that. That's why I shouted. I live in London, at what's sort of becoming the centre of London, is a place called King's Cross, and there was a couple crossing the road, and I know how the road works there. I'm pretty good at dealing with it, although I'm sure I will die by being hit by a vehicle, but I get it. And I saw this couple. I'm not actually sure I saw the couple. I think I saw the woman, and I didn't see the man. And I was crossing, and I was going the other way, and I went, "Hurry up!" to this woman. And she was so shocked at my outburst. And in London, on the whole, it's a city that it's busy, but you don't address people in that way. And she picked up that it had meaning, that maybe I was telling her, there's traffic coming. And she hurried. And she was I then realized, with her extremely big partner. And I'm kind of frightened of men anyway. I like women, I'm uncomfortable with men. Discuss, but... and I suddenly went, I wanted to go, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude to your partner, or whatever their relationship was. And then he picked up that this was pretty ordinary human gesture, which is don't get run down. And then we were on the opposite sides of the road, and there was a bit of smiling and a bit of, a bit of acknowledgement. But those things, that's very like the crack in the glass. They're just little pieces of how we are. And I guess they come a lot in film. There's good filmmaking pays attention to that feeling. And I'm guessing good novels do, but I can't read a novel.
Can you discuss the similarities and differences between needing art in your life versus finding art in your mind?
Oh, what a gorgeous question. Are you an artist?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a kind of major friction, that. I think it's such a... this is a luxuriance of humans, that everybody, everybody here, at the very least, enjoys thinking about. This is so weird. This is so highly educated, and I don't mean that everybody here has got a degree. I just mean that everybody here is thoughtful in a kind of way which is available to humans. But then there's a sort of funny moment where there's an urgency to communicate these feelings to other people, which at one end has ego, I wish to be seen, I want my name on the museum walls, or whatever the codes are of our time. It's funny how many things I must have seen today that are absolutely wonderful. They're all anonymous. I've seen lots of African things, lots of attributed Italian things, but they're not. They're just something that was left behind that got to me by probably another very different culture. And I think that well, I think it's just it's one of those questions, isn't it? It's like a Mobius strip of, and I think I'm not a very productive artist. I don't have a very I don't think I have a brand, which is a disappointing word, but we use it. But I'm completely at ease with that, because I have a sort of private idea that I'm effective. And the way I'm effective is a bit odd, but it's, in fact, I can tell one sort of egotistical story which might possibly be a useful reply, at least shut me up, which is the Tate has a department of interpretation, or whatever, and they write round to everybody each year in the Tate that they want to collect new words. And so about 3 years ago, somebody wrote the word Wentworthian and sent it to this department, and in all sincerity, apparently, which I didn't hear about it till much later. So they being frightfully sensible in the Department of Interpretation, wrote back and said, what would that be? And whoever was responsible for proposing it said, well, it's an image, obviously. And they went, no, we're only dealing with words. So it was disqualified. And actually, I just think the idea of that is, that's why I wrote the glossary. The glossary is like, anybody could write their 100 favorite words. It's like, it's not an answer, but it's, I'm speaking to you. I am.
You saw me cock my head.
Actually, I can't see that.
Anyone else?
I tell you seem to be pessimistic. Will you defend it?
I'd have to ask you what your first language was.
Pessimistic.
Yes, but what is your first language? Buenas. Hola. Well, I don't know how this works in your first language, but in English we have ironic, skeptical, cynical, sardonic, there's about 3 more across this territory. And I'm English, and a lot of English people are very ironic. That means you can actually say the complete opposite to what you mean, but you must be speaking to another English person. No, I think I'm very, very optimistic, actually, but I realize how pathetic we are, how weird the conditions of our lives are, the fictions of our lives, and a lot of the fictions that we live with have been invented in my lifetime. I mean, if I was to write a list of all my equipment, imagine all the things that, I don't mean that I own, but the kind of, all this stuff that enables me to function, which 100 years ago just didn't even exist. And if it did exist, it couldn't have worked because there was a lack of electricity. And we don't, that could be taught or that could be discussed in school much more, because you then feel much more productively vulnerable. So I don't think I'm pessimistic.
In fact, I didn't say it because I thought you were. But somehow it might keep that perception. So I just was curious about your answer to
No, it's a very nice question.
Does that mean that you're...
But definitely, I didn't think you were. I think
Yeah, it was, is that provocar? Is that provocando?
Does that mean your work is quite English then?
Oh, actually, that's the wrong place to shoot yourself. Well, I am, I wasn't meaning to I think it's very interesting that that culture with a little c, what a funny thing that is, so whether you are Spanish or, de la America del Sur or whatever, that means that you have for a start, that probably means you have a comprehension of Catholicism. Not directly, but you probably can smell it. You can smell it. I have no idea. I live with a woman, my wife, who is sort of emotionally Jewish, but not, who was sent to a convent, who is not a Catholic, who was kind of tortured, not literally, but, wasn't great when she was a child, who shouts at the television, shouts at religious things, because she didn't receive, it didn't help her moral disposition. So I live with her, so I know that that's how she is. But we're all as weird as that. And I'm not attributing anything, I'm just saying that that's why it's fun to talk about difference. It's, and I am English, so the answer is I'm English. I spent my entire life trying to get off the island. It's very difficult, And if you're not from an island, I really, because we're in Texas, I mean, I went to Cuba twice this year, in March and then in May. And one of the things that came up was that it has an island mentality, and it has attracted, over time, a lot of other people with an island mentality. So people from what are they called? Balearic Islands, from other islands, because it's a different kind of space. And we forget, geography is history. It's a very powerful organizational thing. Whether you wake up with the sun in your eyes in the morning because you sleep facing south or you sleep facing north, these are quite big conditions because we're animals, I guess. No, I'm not pessimistic. Thank you. Gracias. Bedtime.
Do you think of the photographs in particular, maybe all of your work, but the photographs in particular, the making, doing, getting by, do you ever think of them as conversations with strangers? Like the moment you acknowledge that you were in conversation with that person or the people that made that happen, and I sense it's like...
Yes, I think actually there's a man who would give you a very somber lecture, but he's a very interesting man who runs something called Art Angel in London, called James Lingwood. And he was asked in one of these sort of circumstances, what do you think Richard will do? There was some artwork in the pipeline. And he said, well, whatever it will be convivial. And I just thought for me, it was a sort of luxury remark, because convivial makes it sound like I'm going to have drinks with everybody and we're all going to have a jolly time. But actually, it just means living, con with and viv live. And I think it is, I am sympathetic with. I'm very, very nervous of the act of taking a photograph where I think that somebody will come and stop me. And I have quite elaborate methods for making that a positive event. So I have to kind of create an atmosphere of admiration, or this is amazing, who did this? Slightly shaming sometimes, but getting somebody to realize that I'm not a spy or because a lot of the spaces I'm interested in are just the other side of where you might. I don't really like to be where I'm meant to be. I'd much rather walk. In fact, I find that very interesting around your house. I don't quite know what the status is of the sidewalk and then what you call the yards. I mean, I'm not sure. Could I walk down all the yards? But there's a funny feeling. But you see, that shows how your dog will walk over everything, and it's not stupid. But a human goes, I think this is a different order of space. And so we're very self-policing, and we read that. A child doesn't read that until they're about 5, usually because they've been shouted at. Don't go on the grass. So I'm going to say thank you, because I feel this is a natural moment to say that. So thank you.